The day I found my windmill torn to pieces, I knew it wasn't just vandalism, it was a declaration of war from the HOA. They thought they could bully me on my own land, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. What started as a petty feud turned into a battle over water rights. And let me tell you, I made sure they learned the hard way that I wasn't a man to cross. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. I woke up that morning expecting it to be just another quiet day on my ranch. The sun was barely creeping over the hills, casting a soft golden light across the pasture. Usually, I'd hear the rhythmic creak of my old windmill turning in the breeze, a sound I'd grown up with since I was a boy. It was the heartbeat of my land, pumping fresh water from the well for the cattle and for me. But that day, there was only silence, a heavy, unsettling silence. Something didn't feel right. I set my coffee down on the porch rail and walked out, my boots sinking into the damp morning soil. The moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. My windmill, my father's windmill, was lying in a mangled heap. The blades were twisted and bent. The tower collapsed like a snapped twig. The sight hit me harder than I expected. That windmill wasn't just a machine. It was part of my history. My father and I built it together 30 years ago, and it had stood through every storm since. I knelt down beside the wreckage, running my hand along the jagged metal. This wasn't the work of nature. No windstorm could cut through bolts this cleanly or tear steel like paper. Someone had done this deliberately. My blood began to boil as I spotted something sticking out of the dirt nearby, a bright orange notice stapled to a wooden stake. I ripped it out of the ground and read the bold letters. This structure violates HOA guidelines and must be removed. Consider this your final warning. Final warning, I hadn't received any first warning. I didn't need to read the small print at the bottom to know who was behind it. HOA Karen. Karen had been a thorn in my side from the day she moved into the community. Late 50s, always dressed in pastel cardigans, hair cut sharp enough to match her tone, she carried herself like she was queen of the neighborhood. She'd fined me once for parking my pickup too visibly near the road. She'd complained about the unsightly fence I'd built with my own hands. She even left passive-aggressive notes on my gate about maintaining visual harmony. But this destroying my windmill crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I straightened up and scanned the horizon, half expecting to see her standing there with that smug, self-satisfied smirk. Maybe she had watched this whole thing happen. Maybe she thought I'd just roll over and take it, like some beaten dog. She didn't know me at all. That afternoon, I called a few neighbors I trusted, old-timers who had lived here long before the HOA existed. Over coffee at the diner, I learned the truth that made my jaw clench tighter with every word. Karen had been pushing a new community improvement policy. She claimed my windmill spoiled the neighborhood's image and consumed too much groundwater. Truth was, she wanted to reroute more water for the HOA's sparkling blue pool, which, conveniently, sat right across the street from my property. I couldn't believe it. My land, my water, and my windmill all under attack because she wanted her pool to look pretty. That evening, as I walked the property line, the pieces started to click together. I remembered something important from the dusty stack of land records my father left me. Not only did I own this ranch, but I also had legal rights to the section of river running along its southern border. If Karen wanted a fight over water, she was about to find out she'd picked the wrong man. I stood over the windmill's remains as the sun went down, the sky burning orange and red behind me. My reflection stared back in the twisted metal, angry, determined, unshakable. "You want war," I muttered under my breath. "You've got it." That night, sleep never came. I spread old maps and water surveys across my kitchen table, running my fingers over every contour line and boundary. My father had been meticulous about documenting every inch of this land, and I intended to use that to my advantage. By midnight, I had the beginnings of a plan, a way to turn this attack on me into the biggest mistake Karen and her HOA had ever made. The morning after discovering my windmill in ruins, I didn't just wake up angry, I woke up with a purpose. My coffee was still brewing when I saw another HOA envelope shoved into my mailbox. The bright red letters on the front read, "Urgent, HOA Notice." My jaw tightened. I ripped it open right there at the end of the driveway. my boots scraping against the gravel. The letter was signed by none other than Karen in her perfect, looping handwriting that screamed superiority. It stated that my property was in serious violation of neighborhood aesthetics and that the HOA would be issuing a fine of $1,000 for non-compliant structures. Non-compliant. That windmill had stood for decades before Karen even knew this town existed. She had no authority over my ranch. It wasn't part of their cookie-cutter suburban development. My land had been here long before the HOA bought up empty lots for their manicured lawns and soulless houses. I drove straight to the HOA office that afternoon. Karen was there, of course, standing behind the reception desk like she owned the place. She was dressed in her usual pastel pink cardigan, pearls around her neck, and that smug expression plastered on her face. "Well, well," she said, crossing her arms as I stepped in. "I was wondering when you'd come storming in here. I assume you've read our notice." "Your notice," I said, slamming the crumpled letter on the counter. "You mean this piece of garbage? You destroyed my windmill. Karen, that was trespassing and vandalism." Her smirk didn't budge. "Your windmill was an eyesore. It didn't meet community standards, and we gave you plenty of time to remove it. You chose to ignore the rules." "What rules?" I shot back. "This ranch isn't even part of your HOA jurisdiction. You don't get to dictate what I build on my own land." Karen tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, but you see, the water your windmill was pumping from the ground, that affects the whole community. And as the HOA president, I have a duty to protect shared resources." I stared at her, stunned by the audacity. "Shared resources. That's my well, my land. You have nothing to do with it." She leaned closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "You can fight me if you want, but I've got the board behind me. You'll lose. You'll pay the fine. And if you keep causing problems, we'll have no choice but to take legal action." Her words echoed in my head as I walked out of that office, my fists clenched. Legal action against me. She didn't even realize how far out of her league she was. That evening, I met with my neighbor Hank, a retired county surveyor who had lived in the area for nearly 50 years. Hank was the kind of man who knew every boundary marker, every property line, every inch of water rights carved into this land. When I showed him the HOA notice, he chuckled so hard I thought he'd choke on his beer. "They don't have a leg to stand on," Hank said, slapping the papers down. "Your property line sits squarely outside their jurisdiction, and that river, you've got primary water rights. Son, you could redirect half of it through your land if you wanted." And they couldn't say a damn thing. The more Hank explained, the clearer my path became. Karen had made this personal by destroying my windmill and trying to muscle me with bogus fines. But I wasn't just going to rebuild my windmill. I was going to teach her and her precious HOA a lesson they'd never forget. Over the next few days, Karen escalated her attacks. I found another notice taped to my gate claiming that my barn violated neighborhood standards. She even sent some HOA volunteers to inspect my property, though they never set foot past the fence once they saw me waiting with my arms crossed. Every new threat only fueled the fire burning inside me. One afternoon, as I stood by the riverbank watching the current roll lazily downstream, I realized the irony. Karen's prized HOA pool depended on this river. Without its steady flow, the pumps feeding that pool would go dry in just days. A slow smile crept across my face. If she wanted to play games with my water, maybe it was time I reminded her who controlled the lifeline of this community. The day after my showdown with Karen at the HOA office, I drove into town determined to gather every bit of information I could about my land and water rights. I wasn't going to rely on rumors or assumptions. If Karen wanted to make this a legal battle, I needed evidence so solid that even her smug grin would disappear. I started at the county records office, a place I hadn't set foot in for years. The air smelled like old paper and dust, and the walls were lined with shelves stacked with decades of property files. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly clerk who had worked there for as long as I could remember, recognized me right away. "Well, if it isn't Luke Harper," she said with a warm smile. "Haven't seen you in ages." "What brings you here, Trouble?" I said with a sigh. The HOA presidents decided to pick a fight with me. I need to look at all the old property and water rights records for my ranch, especially anything about the river. Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow. Karen? Huh. She's been causing headaches for half the county since she got that HOA crown. You're not the first man to come in here after one of her stunts. That made me feel better already. Within minutes, she had me set up at a big oak table with a stack of files going back over 50 years. I pored over every document: surveys, land deeds, water rights agreements. My father's name was on many of them, his neat handwriting marking the boundaries of the property. I found one record from 1978 that spelled it out clearly. Harper Ranch holds primary rights to the southern river bend, including diversion for agricultural use, with no limitations by adjoining residential developments. That single line was worth more than gold to me. It meant that, legally, I could divert part of the river's flow for my own needs, and there wasn't a thing Karen could do about it. But the more I read, the more I realized how deep this fight could go. I found notes about a water-sharing dispute from years ago, long before Karen moved in. It had been resolved in favor of my family because the Harper Ranch predated the HOA by decades. This wasn't just about the Windmill anymore. Karen was trying to rewrite history and claim something that was never hers. After hours at the records office, I drove over to see Hank again. He was sitting on his porch, rocking slowly in his chair, sipping iced tea. I dropped the files on the table in front of him, and his eyes lit up. "Son, you've got her beat 10 times over with this," Hank said, flipping through the papers. "These records are airtight. If you want to rebuild that windmill or even put up a whole water tower, she can't stop you. And if you want to make a statement," he leaned in, lowering his voice, "you could divert the river just enough to remind her who really controls this land." I sat back, letting that idea sink in. It wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was justice. Karen had no right to destroy my property and bully me with bogus fines. If cutting off her precious pool water was what it took to get her attention, then so be it. That evening, I walked along the southern edge of my ranch where the river curved through a small canyon. The water glistened under the setting sun, a steady, powerful current that had sustained this land long before the HOA existed. I ran my hand through the cool stream, imagining how easy it would be to adjust its flow with a few well-placed barriers. As I stood there, I thought back to my father's words. He always told me, "Son, the land will treat you as well as you treat it. Stand up for it, and it'll stand up for you." I felt a renewed sense of purpose that night. By the time I got back to the house, I had made up my mind. I called a local irrigation specialist I knew, a man named Roy, who had worked on every farm and ranch in the county. When I told him my idea, there was a long pause before he chuckled. "Well, Luke, I can't say I've ever been hired to outsmart an HOA before," he said, "but I like the way you're thinking. It's legal, and you've got the rights. I'll draw up a plan." With Roy on board, I knew things were about to get interesting. The very next morning, I heard the sound of engines near my property line. When I stepped outside, my blood ran cold. Karen had gone too far this time. 2 trucks, loaded with tools and construction equipment, were parked right by my broken windmill. Standing next to them was Karen herself, flanked by 2 hired contractors. She wore oversized sunglasses, a pastel blue cardigan, and that all-too-familiar smirk that made my fists itch. "What the hell are you doing on my land?" I barked as I marched toward them. Karen didn't flinch. In fact, she looked almost pleased with herself. "Good morning, Mr. Harper," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I'm just here to ensure that all non-compliant structures are removed. Since you seem unwilling to clean up this eyesore, I've taken the liberty of hiring professionals to do it for you. You'll be receiving the bill." "Of course." I stood there, dumbfounded for a moment, watching as one of the contractors fired up a saw and started cutting through what was left of the windmill's support beams. "Shut that off," I shouted, my voice echoing across the pasture. The man paused and looked at Karen, unsure. "You heard me," I said. "Stepping between them and the windmill. This is private property. You have no right to touch anything here. And if you don't leave in the next 30 seconds, I'm calling the sheriff." Karen's smirk widened. "Oh, please, Luke, Go ahead and call. Let's see what they say when they find out you've been violating community rules. I'll be happy to show them all the notices I sent you." My jaw tightened so hard I thought my teeth would crack. I pulled my phone out and started dialing the sheriff's office. Karen must have sensed I wasn't bluffing because she threw up a hand and motioned for her contractors to stop. "Fine," she said, her tone turning icy. "But this isn't over. You can't just do whatever you want and expect the HOA to stay quiet. We have standards. And if you don't like them, maybe you should consider selling your land to someone who respects the community." I took a step closer, meeting her gaze with all the fury building inside me. "Karen, this land has been mine since before you even knew this place existed. You think your little HOA board can scare me? Try me. But next time you step foot on my property, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. That's a promise." For the first time, her confidence cracked just slightly. She turned on her heel and stomped back toward her SUV, muttering something under her breath about uncooperative neighbors. The contractors followed quickly, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire. As I stood there, my boots planted firmly on my own land, I knew this war wasn't going to end with words. Karen wasn't the kind of person to back down, and neither was I. That afternoon, Hank stopped by after hearing about the commotion. "You're handling her better than most," he said, leaning on his truck. "But you've got to watch her. She'll twist every rule in the book if it means getting her way." I nodded, already thinking several steps ahead. I'm done playing defense. "Hank, if she wants to fight, I'll give her one. But I'm not just going to rebuild that windmill. I'm going to make sure she regrets ever stepping onto my land." Hank grinned. "Now you're talking like a Harper." We spent the next couple of hours walking the riverbank, marking out possible spots where we could adjust the flow. Roy, the irrigation specialist, arrived later with a set of plans. He explained how we could divert just enough water to keep my ranch thriving while leaving the HOA pool high and dry. It was legal, and it was within my rights. By the time the sun set, I had a clear strategy. I'd rebuild, but not just my windmill. I'd reclaim control over my water, my land, and my peace of mind. That night, I sat on my porch with a glass of whiskey, watching the stars blink above the dark hills. Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought her power over the HOA made her queen. But soon, she'd learn a hard lesson this ranch wasn't hers to control. The morning after Karen's latest stunt, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. She thought she could tear down my windmill and bully me into compliance, but she had no idea how far I was willing to go to protect what's mine. Over my first cup of coffee, I spread Roy's irrigation plans across the kitchen table. The neat blue lines on his drawings told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just possible. It was entirely legal. Roy had a way of explaining things simply. "Luke," he said as we walked along the riverbank the day before, "you've got primary rights to this water. That means you can build diversion systems for agriculture, ranching, whatever you need without asking permission from anyone. If this HOA's pool depends on the same water source, that's their problem, not yours." Those words stuck with me. Karen wanted a fight over water. I'd give her one, but I'd make sure I fought smart. My father always said, "You don't win battles by shouting. You win them by thinking 2 steps ahead." That was exactly what I intended to do. By mid-morning, Roy arrived at the ranch in his old pickup, a stack of survey equipment in the back. Hank joined us not long after, bringing a cooler of iced tea and his encyclopedic knowledge of the land. The 3 of us stood by the river as Roy explained his plan in detail. "We'll install a series of sluice gates here," he said, pointing to a bend in the river where the current slowed. "A small trench will divert some of the flow toward your irrigation pond. It won't drain the river. It'll just reroute enough to keep your ranch well supplied." Hank chuckled. "And leave that HOA pool bone dry if they don't start pumping their own water." "I like it." I nodded, my mind already visualizing the outcome. Karen had destroyed my windmill, but now I had something better, a system she couldn't touch, couldn't sabotage, and couldn't legally stop. That evening, I started gathering materials. I bought heavy-duty steel gates, concrete mix, and new piping from the supply store in town. The clerk raised an eyebrow when I loaded everything into my truck. "Big project?" he asked. "You could say that," I replied, giving him a half smile. "Just taking control of my water situation." Back at the ranch, I walked the riverbank again. noting every slope and bend. As I stood there under the fading sunlight, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about taking back control. Karen had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let her or anyone else push me around again. Over the next few days, Roy and his crew began the work. They dug a narrow trench along the southern edge of my property, reinforcing it with concrete. Sluice gates were installed, their heavy steel frames gleaming in the sun. I worked alongside them every day, my hands blistered and sore, but my determination sharper than ever. Karen must have noticed something was going on, because by the third day, she was parked at the edge of my property in her shiny SUV, arms crossed as she watched. I could practically feel her glare. "What exactly do you think you're building there?" "Luke," she called out, her voice sharp as a whip. I wiped the sweat from my brow and looked straight at her. "I'm making sure my ranch has enough water. Perfectly legal." "You got a problem with that?" She narrowed her eyes. "Don't think I don't see what you're doing. You're trying to starve the HOA pool." I shrugged. "I'm just taking care of my own land." "Karen, if your pool runs dry, maybe you'll think twice before destroying someone else's property." Her face turned red with fury, but for once, she had nothing to say. She slammed her car door and sped off, tires spitting gravel. By the end of the week, the diversion system was complete. I watched as water flowed smoothly into my new irrigation pond, filling it to the brim. It felt like reclaiming not just the land, but my dignity. That night, I sat on my porch, sipping whiskey and listening to the steady trickle of water in the distance. The stars stretched across the sky like a quiet promise. I knew Karen wouldn't take this lying down. She'd come back, angrier and more desperate than before. But now, I was ready. It didn't take long for the impact of my new diversion system to hit Karen right where it hurt. By the third day, the HOA pool, her beloved symbol of community pride, was starting to look less like a neighborhood oasis and more like an abandoned construction site. The once shimmering water had dropped several inches, revealing faded blue paint at the shallow end. By the fifth day, the filters were groaning, and the pumps struggled to keep up. I stood on my porch that morning, sipping my coffee, watching Karen pace along the pool fence like a general watching her fortress crumble, even from a distance. I could see the panic in her body language, hands flying, phone glued to her ear, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She barked orders at the maintenance crew as if sheer volume would make the water rise. Later that afternoon, I took a walk down to my new irrigation pond. The sound of water flowing into it was like music to my ears. It wasn't just about having plenty of water for the ranch, it was about reclaiming control. Karen had declared war on my land, and I had answered in a way that left her powerless. That evening, I was mending a section of fence near our shared boundary when I overheard her voice. She was standing just out of sight, yelling at one of the pool workers. "I don't care what it takes, fix it. That pool is the centerpiece of this community. Do you hear me? We cannot have it looking like some cheap motel pond." I couldn't help but smirk. I leaned on my post hole digger, letting her words carry on the breeze. For all her threats and fines, Karen was powerless against one simple fact. I owned the water rights. And there wasn't a lawyer or HOA rulebook that could change that. By the sixth day, Karen had reached a boiling point. I saw her SUV coming up my driveway, tires crunching the gravel like they were as angry as she was. She jumped out, wearing white sneakers, tailored jeans, and a pastel yellow cardigan, the kind of outfit that screamed suburban queen. "Luke Harper," she shouted the moment her feet hit the ground. "What in the world do you think you're doing with that river? Our pool is almost dry. Do you have any idea how many complaints I've gotten from the board? From the neighbors?" I leaned casually against my truck, arms crossed. Sounds like a lot of people are suddenly realizing where their water comes from. Maybe that's a good thing. Her face turned red. "This is sabotage. You're trying to destroy our community. I'll have you fined for this." I laughed. A slow, deliberate laugh that I knew would cut deep. "Fined, Karen. You have no authority over my land or my water. I'm within my rights. And frankly, after you trespassed and destroyed my windmill, you should consider yourself lucky I didn't press charges." Karen's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't play games with me. Luke, I've run this HOA for 10 years. I know how to win battles like this." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "Karen, I don't care how many years you've been pushing people around. This land doesn't answer to you, and neither do I. If you want water for that pool, maybe try coming here with an apology instead of a threat." For the first time, I saw her hesitate. She wasn't used to people standing their ground. Without another word, she spun on her heel, got into her SUV, and sped off, gravel flying behind her. That night, I got a visit from two HOA board members, Jeff and Susan. They were polite, but clearly caught in the middle. "Luke," Jeff started, nervously rubbing the back of his neck, "we understand you're frustrated with Karen, but is there any way you could ease up on the river? The pool is nearly dry, and the neighbors are starting to complain." I looked at them steadily. "Where were you when she tore down my windmill, when she fined me for a fence that had stood for 20 years? You let her run this place like a dictator, and now you want me to play nice." "Not happening," Susan sighed. "We can't control her all the time. She's difficult." "Then maybe it's time someone reminded her and you what respect looks like," I said, my voice firm. "Until Karen makes this right, my water stays right here on my land." They left, looking uneasy. But I didn't care. I wasn't backing down. By the weekend, word spread through the neighborhood. Some folks came by, nodding in approval, even quietly thanking me for standing up to Karen. She's had it coming for years. One neighbor whispered, "That night, I sat by the irrigation pond under a sky full of stars, listening to the trickle of water feeding my land." This wasn't just revenge anymore, it was balance. For too long, Karen had bullied everyone around her. Now, for the first time, she was the one losing control. The HOA pool was bone dry by Monday morning. By then, the cracked white bottom was visible for everyone to see, and the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. Folks who used to nod politely to Karen at board meetings were now glaring at her as they walked past. It didn't take long for her carefully built reputation to start crumbling. From my porch, I saw her storming around the pool area, waving her arms like a madwoman. The maintenance crew had already packed up, shrugging helplessly when they realized the pumps were useless without water flowing in from the river. Every time she looked my way, I could feel her frustration burning hotter. That evening, I got word that Karen had called an emergency HOA meeting at the clubhouse. Hank suggested we both attend after all. I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I'd become the topic of every whisper in the neighborhood. When we arrived, the room was already full. Karen stood at the front with her arms crossed, a brittle smile plastered on her face. She wore her signature pastel pink cardigan, but tonight, it didn't make her look polished. It made her look desperate. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her tone sugary but strained. "We have a serious issue with the community pool due to, well, certain selfish actions by a resident who thinks the rules don't apply to him." I stepped forward before she could continue. "You mean me?" "Karen, go ahead. Say it out loud." A murmur rippled through the room. Some neighbors leaned in, clearly eager to see where this was going. Karen's smile faltered, but she kept her voice steady. "Luke Harper, your recent actions have jeopardized the entire community. Diverting water from the river, diverting water that belongs to me." I interrupted. "Let's get that straight. This ranch was here decades before your HOA was even a thought. I have primary rights to that river, and I'll use it how I see fit. You want water for your fancy pool? Maybe you should have thought of that before you destroyed my windmill." Gasps filled the room. Several people turned to Karen, whispering furiously. A man from the back stood up and shouted, "Wait, did you really destroy his windmill?" Karen's face went pale. That's not what happened," she stammered. "The windmill was non-compliant, and I was simply non-compliant." I cut in, my voice echoing through the clubhouse. "That windmill was on my private property. You trespassed. Karen, you vandalized something my father and I built with our own hands. And now you're crying about a pool. You don't get to play victim here." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then, one of the board members, Susan, who had come to see me earlier, stood up. "Karen, is this true? Did you really order his windmill to be torn down?" Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The board members exchanged looks, and I knew right then that her reign was cracking. "Here's how this is going to go," I said firmly. I'm not turning that water back on until I get a public apology and full payment for the damage to my property. If that means your pool stays dry for the rest of the summer, so be it." A few neighbors clapped quietly, and the room erupted into chatter. Karen's face turned crimson as she realized she was losing the crowd. "This is outrageous," she shouted, her voice trembling. "You're all siding with him. He's breaking the rules. There are no rules that apply to him." Someone from the back said, "This isn't HOA land. Karen, you've been overstepping for years, and we're tired of it." The board quickly moved to adjourn the meeting before things got uglier. Karen stormed out, her heels clicking against the wooden floor like gunshots. I followed Hank outside, feeling the weight of the moment. "Looks like you just knocked the queen off her throne," Hank said with a grin. "About time someone did," I replied, but I knew this wasn't quite over yet. Karen was cornered now, and people like her didn't just admit defeat. Still, for the first time since this war started, I felt the tide turning completely in my favor. The days following the HOA meeting were quiet, almost too quiet. I could tell Karen was stewing, plotting her next move, but the damage to her reputation was already done. The neighborhood was buzzing with talk of her overreach, and for once, people weren't afraid to speak out against her. By midweek, I got a call from Jeff, one of the HOA board members. His tone was sheepish, almost apologetic. "Luke," he began, "we've had another board meeting without Karen. We all agree she went too far. We'd like to make this right. Can we come by tomorrow to discuss a settlement?" I agreed, curious to see what they had in mind. The next afternoon, Jeff and Susan pulled up my driveway with papers in hand. Karen wasn't with them, which already told me everything I needed to know. "Luke," Susan said, her voice steady, "on behalf of the HOA, we want to apologize for Karen's actions. She overstepped her authority, and the board has voted to remove her as president. We also want to cover the full cost of rebuilding your windmill, plus additional compensation for the damage done." I leaned back in my chair on the porch, crossing my arms. "That's a start," I said, "but I want her apology, not just the board's, hers." Susan hesitated. "She's not exactly cooperative right now, but if it means ending this feud, we'll make sure she delivers one publicly." I gave them a long look, then nodded. Until then, that river stays diverted. 2 days later, Karen herself showed up at my ranch, but this time, she looked nothing like the queen of the HOA. She was dressed plainly, no pearls or cardigans, just a worn t-shirt and jeans. Her eyes avoided mine as she stepped up to the porch. "I'm here to apologize," she said flatly. "Let's hear it," I replied, my tone as firm as ever. She took a deep breath, visibly forcing the words out. "I was wrong to destroy your windmill and trespass on your property. I let my position go to my head. I'm sorry." I studied her for a moment, making sure she meant it, or at least meant enough to say it out loud. "You're not just apologizing to me," I said. "You'll stand in front of the board and the neighbors you bullied, and you'll tell them the same thing." Her shoulders sagged, but she nodded. "Fine, I'll do it." That weekend, the HOA gathered for another meeting, this time without the glitz and power Karen once flaunted. Standing at the front of the room, she gave a strained but genuine apology. The neighbors listened, some with folded arms, some with quiet satisfaction. It was clear she'd lost her hold over them. When it was over, I stood and addressed the room. "I'm restoring the river flow," I announced. "But let this be a lesson. My land is my land. If anyone sets foot on it again without my permission, I won't hesitate to take it further. We all live here. We can either respect each other, or we can keep fighting. And I'm done fighting." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was heartfelt. People were relieved, maybe even inspired, to see someone stand up against the HOA's overreach. The next week, Roy and I rebuilt the windmill stronger, taller, and better than before. As the blades turned in the summer breeze, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. That evening, Hank came over with a couple of cold beers. We sat on the porch watching the sun sink over the hills. "You know," he said, "you didn't just win against Karen. You reminded this whole neighborhood that folks like us don't roll over just because someone waves a piece of paper at us." I smiled, raising my bottle. "To standing our ground, to standing our ground," Hank echoed. clinking his bottle against mine. As the windmill creaked softly in the distance and the river flowed steady and strong, I knew one thing for sure: Karen had learned her lesson, and justice had been served not through shouting or chaos, but through grit, patience, and a little clever thinking. When I look back at everything that happened, the broken windmill, the dry pool, the battles and the meetings, it all comes down to one simple truth: you can't let anyone trample on what's rightfully yours. I didn't win this fight because I was louder or meaner. I won because I stood my ground, trusted the history of this land, and refused to back down when I was in the right. Now, as the windmill turns again and the river flows strong through my ranch, I feel a deep sense of peace. Justice wasn't just served for me. It reminded everyone around here that respect and fairness matter more than control and arrogance. If you've ever faced someone like Karen, someone who thinks they can take whatever they want, remember this story. Stand tall, fight smart, and never let them take your pride. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If this hit home for you, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about standing up for what's right.